If you told a general of the Roman Republic or early Imperial Rome that one of their most successful generals, indeed some historians argue the greatest Roman general of all time, would be a eunuch, they would have been horrified. However, by Narses' time in the 5th and 6th centuries, Roman attitudes toward eunuchs had evolved quite a bit. Eunuchs were now expected to play such roles as chamberlains, but many illustrious eunuchs made their way through the imperial households and the Christian church to higher offices. That said, a eunuch in Rome was usually imported from the outside due to an earlier Roman law that held that males could not be castrated within the borders of the Roman Empire, no doubt much to the relief of men throughout the empire. One popular source for eunuchs was Persian-held Armenia, or Persarmenia, where the man of the hour, Narses himself, came from. As for that man, it isn't known exactly when he was born, simply sometime around 479, give or take a few years. On this note, in later life, it was known that he would often help defecting Persian Armenians settle in the Roman Empire. He was able to do this because of his role as Emperor Justinian's chamberlain. Earning considerable favor as a servant to Justinian, Narses moved up the ranks rapidly in the palace hierarchy, eventually making it up to Grand Chamberlain, and was entrusted with civil duties as a treasurer for Justinian. Little is known about Narses' time in other positions, though it's clear from all this and what came after that he had a particular talent as an administrator. This brings us to his rise to military excellence, which is really just administration on a different kind of battlefield. Narses' run as a military figure began thanks to a riot, though at this point he didn't command troops against the rioters or anything of the sort, simply he saved Justinian rule through his shrewd actions. The Nika riots happened in 532 and led to a near coup of Justinian, complete with a counter-emperor crowned and half of Constantinople being burned to the ground. So how did it all start? Well, this potentially history-changing event was all the result of ancient sports fans getting a bit riled up. Rome has a long history of chariot race fans organizing in colors: red, white, blue, and green. These colors and their affiliations had been stirring up trouble since Rome was a republic. Like most things Roman, the colors were imported from Rome to Constantinople as a part of the efforts to retain continuity of Roman culture. Eventually, different religions and class identities married themselves to a color, and the factions became more than just representative of supporting a sports team. Think out sports teams in relatively more modern times. From overwhelmingly Catholic cities tend to have Catholic, Irish, and Italian fans who historically incorporated national and religious imagery, while teams from Protestant cities do the same thing. Eventually, supporting your team not only can sometimes imply supporting the team, but also an entire ideology. As for the riots, the blue and green factions ultimately rose up after a race where police clashed with members of the blue and green, having many jailed or executed. It was on with the goal to overthrow Justinian. Thousands of people died in the ensuing riots, and the imperial palace was besieged. While the factions had civil reasons to overthrow Justinian, such as taxes and the like, they also had religious reasons. Justinian and Narses were firm believers in the Christianity that followed the Nicene Creed. The two factions' own religious backgrounds was opposed to this direction of Christianity. In the middle of all of this, with things looking rather dire, Narses was given a mission to somehow convince the leaders of the blue faction to accept a bribe to break their alliance with the greens and turn against them. The blues were targeted here as the counter-emperor crowned during the riots was a green partisan, and it was thought they might be more open to the idea because of this. In the end, whether it was his words or the bribe money or both, Narses was successful in his assignment, and the blues turned against their allies. The result was Justinian seized the city and, after capturing him, put the counter-emperor to death. Thanks to his success in convincing the blues to switch sides, Narses came out of the Nika riots with an extremely bolstered reputation in Justinian's court. Interestingly, another historically noteworthy military leader that made it out of the Nika riots, having established himself as a great leader, was one of Narses' chief rivals as the greatest general in Roman history, Belisarius. Unlike Narses, Belisarius directly led men against the mob, slaughtering many in the epicenter of the riot, the Hippodrome. It's also noteworthy that Belisarius was 27 at the end of the riots, whereas Narses was approximately double his age. After the riots, Justinian had a grand vision of reuniting Rome's fallen western territories from groups like the Goths and Vandals. This included the namesake of the empire, the ancient city of Rome. Now diminished to a Goth-held small city surrounded by ruins, it was no longer the seat of the empire. As part of the effort to rebuild the nation's former glory, Justinian sent Belisarius to recapture Rome's African territories from the Vandals, a job he completed, and more, capturing Sardinia and Corsica all within a year in 534 with about 35,000 soldiers and sailors. With the Vandals no longer a threat, Narses and other commanders moved on to Goth-held territories in Sicily and modern-day Croatia. In 536, Belisarius used Sicily as a launching point into Italy, even entering Rome for a prolonged siege at the end of the year. To aid the effort, Justinian sent Narses with 5,000 to 7,000 mostly non-Roman soldiers to reinforce Belisarius. However, to Belisarius' surprise, Justinian gave command of these to Narses. As to why, it's speculated that Belisarius' troops were now highly seasoned and also fiercely loyal to their general, and thus he could have posed a threat to Justinian now that he had seized Rome. Narses, on the other hand, was loyal to Justinian, and as a eunuch had no family or ability to gain the imperial throne. In short, Justinian trusted Narses more and seemingly wanted to curtail some of Belisarius' hold over the region. As you might expect, there seemed to be issues with the partnership between Narses and Belisarius and their supporting commanders. In fact, it's noteworthy that very quickly the two leaders developed an extreme distrust for one another, which is something of a historic shame given they are seen as two of the greatest, if not the greatest, generals in Roman history, and they were fighting more or less side by side. In the end, this conflict and lack of unified coordination ultimately led to gaining and losing various territories repeatedly as the military leaders couldn't get on the same page. As a result of all of this, in 538, Justinian sent a letter putting full command back in the hands of Belisarius that stated, "We have not sent our steward Narses to Italy in order to command the army, for we wish Belisarius alone to command the whole army in whatever manner seems to him to be the best, and it is the duty of all of you to follow him in the interest of our state." The letter came too little too late, as the divided command led to the loss of Milan in 539. Belisarius himself reported the loss to Justinian, at which point Justinian recalled Narses back to Constantinople to resume the civil activities which he was so talented at. That said, we don't have any evidence of a soured relationship between the emperor and the chamberlain at this point or ever. The emperor even allowed him to recruit soldiers he fought with as guardsmen back in Constantinople, a high honor for a civilian. On the other hand, Belisarius continued the reconquest and fight against the Goths for several years after Narses' recall with extreme distinction. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, isn't Narses supposed to have been one of, if not the greatest of all Roman generals? And I mean, so far, nothing we've said seems to paint him as such. In fact, quite the opposite. And given his age and the era he lived in, you probably think that he didn't have much time left to change our opinion. But you'd be wrong. His military fame as a successful and rather ingenious general happens much later in life, at a point well after most of us even today have retired. On this note, despite being in his 50s or 60s at this point, it would be another 12 years before Narses got back in the military saddle, and in the meantime, Belisarius defeated the Goths, fought Franks and Huns, and even went east to fight the Persians between 541 and 544. At some point, a member of Justinian's household and military leader, Chilburius, was killed in battle in Eastern Europe. The slave captured by a Slavic group took advantage of the situation and claimed to be Chilburius in a scheme that would benefit him and his master. Narses, who was on a diplomatic mission, met the fake Chilburius, and because he served Justinian's household, was able to expose the fake, who was brought back with Narses as a prisoner. On the other ends of things, in 549, Belisarius was recalled, and a series of 5 consecutive generals could not stem a resurgent Gothic wave after Belisarius left the field. Fed up, Justinian wanted once and for all to reconquer Italy, and to that purpose he curiously appointed the 70-plus-year-old Narses as supreme commander in 551 and sent him westward. Previous to this, Narses was planning on retiring in a monastery that had built himself in Cappadocia. He was almost out, but they pulled him back in thanks to a good omen and a prophecy from an Etruscan senator. The prophecy came in a dream where a castrated bull led a herd of cattle into Rome and mounted the statue of the bronze bull in front of the Forum of Peace. The significance of this bronze bull is interesting because it was sculpted by an Etruscan for the Athenians and was later moved to Rome, representing possibly not just the empire, but the entire Hellenic world. So off Narses went, along with his predecessor to aid him. As for Narses, while he may not have been a lifelong military man or anything of the sort, he was, as noted, well acquainted with administration, and particularly with management of the imperial treasury. He knew how to stretch the gold and manage people, supplies and supply lines and things like that. Thus, among his first acts, he paid off many defected troops to return, in some cases in doing so both weakening some of his enemies while strengthening his lines. From here, he met his forces in modern-day Croatia and planned his invasion of Italy for the spring of the following year, ultimately making it to the city of Ravenna in 552 with the help of locals and Lombardian mercenaries. Once there, he defeated a Gothic leader in a skirmish. This caught the attention of the Gothic king Totila, Belisarius' perpetual enemy. Totila and Narses would later face each other in the history-changing Battle of Tanganae in 552, in which Narses, using a rather unorthodox distribution of his troops, all arrayed in a crescent shape flanked by archers, soundly crushed Totila's attacking forces, killing more than a third of the estimated 15,000 troops, as well as Totila himself, either mortally wounding him in the battle or shortly after managing to kill him, fleeing from it. Beyond the obvious death of the king, this battle was significant on a number of points, including that Totila was extremely well versed in Roman military tactics and even had many former Roman soldiers under his command. Yet Narses' rather ingenious formations and battle strategy bested him and his forces soundly, leaving them flummoxed very quickly and in complete disarray, more or less slaughtered left and right because of it. Further, in the battle between who was the better general, Belisarius or Narses, it's noteworthy that in all the years they'd sparred, Belisarius hadn't been able to vanquish Totila. Narses seemingly did it easily and quickly with his tactics. From here, Narses marched on Rome, and once again with a clever use of archers attacking on one side while his other soldiers swooped in on the other, in only a few days he'd managed to retake the city. Rome was Roman once again. The stability Narses brought to Rome is pointed to by historians as the transition from the ancient city to its medieval form. From here, Narses and Totila's successor, Teias, had a variety of skirmishes. At the same time, Narses dispatched an army to the former Greek colony of Cumae in Campania. Ultimately, Teias ran into Narses' forces at the banks of the Draco, and his back was up against the mountains. Imperial ships arrived from the water, and Teias had to retreat up into those mountains with his troops. Running short of supplies, Teias tried to attack Narses in the spring in a bit of a blitzkrieg that can best be described as fortune favors the bold, except this time it didn't. It is noted that in the battle, Totila multiple times had his shield riddled with arrows, only to pass it off to one of his men and be handed a new one to continue fighting with. But it couldn't last, and he was killed on the first day, though his men kept up the fight anyway for one more day. After the second day of battle, and still getting nowhere, the remaining soldiers agreed to surrender if they would be allowed to leave the country in peace, a condition that Narses agreed to. From here, Narses prepared to siege Cumae. However, the siege would have to go on without Narses, as up north the Franks and their Alemanni allies began attacking Italy. On his way up to deal with the new invasion, Narses managed terms for various surrendering Italian cities to be brought back into the fold at the same time. As an example of the types of non-military tactics he used here, we have the town of Lucca. This town was about to surrender when it was reinforced by the invading armies. Their numbers now bolstered, they changed their mind. However, rather than wasting time, men, and resources fighting, Narses simply threatened to have killed the many hostages he'd managed to capture from the city. When overtures of surrender still failed, he displayed the hostages out in front of the town with a special harness fastened on their necks. He then held a mock execution. The beheadings apparently looked real, and the town was supposedly fooled that he'd done what he said, but he hadn't. Instead, Narses freed all of the prisoners and allowed the grateful individuals to return to the city. The hostages then managed to convince Lucca's leadership to surrender without a fight by elaborating on the man that Narses was, including his reputation for generosity and as a military leader, as well as his skills as a fair and just administrator. On this note, Narses is generally described as having been a very easy person to get along with. He was also reputed to be generous and fair, which brought many parties to the table and ultimately heavily rewarded loyalty. Whether it was because of his personality or his generosity, he seems to have had little trouble keeping many non-Roman allies around him, and in this case managed to take a city without a fight, largely based on this reputation and using some of the town's own people to convince the leaders to surrender after he spared their lives. Moving on from there, the Frankish invasion of Italy was led by two brothers, Busilinus and Lutherus. They came just before winter, and Narses was forced to let them have the countryside initially, despite the devastation on the people and lands. Nevertheless, he found it prudent to winter his soldiers in cities and garrisons, so as not to spread out his forces in the vulnerable countryside. Once winter was done, the brothers marched south into central Italy. However, they made the mistake of splitting their armies in two doing so. This was the undoing of both armies, and Narses' intelligence shines in how he dealt with them. The smaller of the two armies looted and decided to turn back early with the spoils of treasure and slaves. During their march back, Narses' generals ambushed them and their prisoners escaped. As for the army itself, they did manage to initially escape themselves, but only made it as far as Lake Garda, where most of the soldiers died of plague. Ignorant of any of this, the main force continued its conquest, but Narses managed to trap the army in Campania, a wine region that grew little else but grapes. Being trapped there, you can guess what the army was forced to sustain themselves on: grapes, raisins, and poorly brewed wine that made the army sick and weakened. Not knowing what happened to the Second Army, the trapped force thought they would be getting reinforcements eventually and attempted to endure, but these obviously never came. Even though they were still the numerically superior force, Narses attacked first and won with superior strategy, once again leveraging archers and cavalry ingeniously, which were deployed to sow confusion and disorder among his enemy, at which point he would go in for the kill. As with Totila and Teias, it was a bloodbath. After the successful campaign against the Franks, Narses mopped up the remaining invaders in a few sieges and set out to rebuild Italy, which he seems to have done for some amount of years, with success living into his 90s. However, after these massive and sweeping successful campaign and subsequent seemingly brilliant administration, with regards to these last years of his life after the military campaigns were over, we actually don't know much of what happened to Narses. It's thought that he was probably ultimately called back to Constantinople, probably at the call of Constantius II, who inherited the throne after Justinian. Some sources say he died in disgrace and was ejected out of Rome, with the locals contacting the emperor in Constantinople to complain Narses was treating them like slaves, perhaps a historic dig at his own status as a eunuch. But this isn't clear, and also doesn't seem to hold with what we know of his earlier administration. Whatever the case, we don't even know where the man died. In the end, as much as we know about his brilliant military career, we don't have a consensus about how it ended, with the majority of the reports being contradictory and in doubt. One unexpected legacy of the man was the belief that Narses left behind a massive buried treasure. In an effort to rebuild the countryside, Narses levied heavy taxes on the cities. While he was popular, this move might have soured his last days, with his citizens believing he hoarded massive wealth. The legend goes he collected and buried gold, silver, and Roman antiques in one of his many properties, killed any witnesses, and entrusted the location of the buried treasure to one man. Many of the medieval historians who wrote about Narses believed in this treasure, but if it was real, it was never found, and given what we know of his character, it is speculated that he probably simply used the tax money to rebuild the countryside and ravaged lands, as he said he did. Whatever the case, alongside Belisarius of his own era, Narses is generally considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of all Roman generals. Whoever was actually greater, Narses at least shows you that you shouldn't conflate a lack of balls with a lack of badassery.